In Notes 5.5, we are going to talk about naming covalent compounds. Up until this point, everything we've been working with has been an ionic compound, the combination of a metal and a nonmetal. Now we're going to look at the system of naming we use when we name covalent compounds. So, naming what are known as binary molecular compounds. First of all, a binary molecular compound is a compound with two different atoms, hence the binary part. However, the difference is that these two atoms are going to be nonmetals. So when we did ionic compounds, we were using a metal and a nonmetal, but this time, for molecular compounds, we need to recognize them as being two nonmetals. Remember, on our periodic table, the nonmetals are found to the right of our stair step. And so all of the elements in these types of compounds are going to be found on the right-hand side of the periodic table. Molecular compounds are unique because they can combine in more than one way with the same element. So for example, we have carbon that can combine with one oxygen to give me CO, or we can have carbon combining with two oxygens to give me CO2. When we name binary molecular compounds, we're going to start off by naming them the same way as ionic compounds, in that the first element is going to be the name of the element, the second of the element is going to be the name of the element with an IDE ending. However, the difference is that in a molecular compound, we are going to include a prefix to designate how many atoms are present. Recall, prefixes are found at the beginning of the word, and so we're going to add prefixes into our name. Those prefixes will represent the number of atoms of each of the elements present. So when it comes to the prefixes, up until this point, I think you can agree that I have not required you to memorize a whole lot. Unfortunately, the prefixes are something that must be memorized, and so there are prefixes that you are responsible for knowing for the numbers 1 through 10. The prefix for 1 is mono, the prefix for 2 is di, the prefix for 3 is tri, 4 is tetra, 5 is penta, 6 is hexa, 7 is hepta, 8 is octa, 9 is nona, and 10 is deca. It is important to note that these prefixes are only being used for binary molecular compounds. Again, those compounds made up of two nonmetals. Alright, so the easiest way to learn how to do this is to just look at some examples. Okay, so in our first example, we have CO2. Okay, first of all, what we want to recognize is that CO2 is made up of two nonmetals. If we look to, or on the front side of our periodic table, we will see both of these elements are found to the right-hand side of that stair step. When we are naming molecular compounds, we want to make sure that we are not using the charts on the back side of the periodic table, but rather the front side. Okay, so CO2 is our compound. We are going to start by identifying the first element listed in our formula. Okay, the first element listed is C, and if I look on the front side of our periodic table, I see that C is carbon. Okay, we're then going to look at this second element, which is O. O is oxygen, but just like with an ionic compound, we are going to change the ending of the element name to IDE. And so the oxygen becomes oxide. So to start, the name of our compound here, or the name of our molecule, is going to start the same. CO2, we're going to start by calling carbon oxide. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go in and add prefixes. If I look at my chemical formula here, based on this formula, I have one carbon atom. Okay, we don't write subscripts of 1, but we know that with that element there, there's just 1. The prefix for 1, if you recall, is mono. However, if we only have one of the first element, we are not going to include the mono. So therefore, there's no prefix that is needed in front of the carbon. We're going to look now at our second element, which is oxygen, subscript of 2, so I have 2 oxygens. The prefix for 2 is di, and so I'm going to add the prefix di in front of the oxide. And therefore, the name of CO2 becomes carbon dioxide. Okay? If I look at another example, CO, I'm going to start the exact same way. The first element is the name of the element, so we already established that C is carbon. The O is the name of the element with an IDE ending. So I get oxide. Once again, I have only one carbon, so no prefix is needed in the beginning. However, in my second element here, the oxygen, I also have one. And if there's only one of the second element, then we do need to include the prefix. And again, the prefix for one is mono, and so CO we would call carbon monoxide. Okay, one more example. N2O5. So we'll start with N, the name of our element, which is nitrogen. Once again, O is oxide. 2 nitrogen here, so I would call this dinitrogen. 5 oxygen. Prefix for 5 is pent. Okay, so I end up with dinitrogen pentoxide. Now technically the prefix for 5 is penta. Okay, but usually we don't have 2 vowels next to each other, so we can drop the A and just call it dinitrogen pentoxide. If you included the A when you named it, I would not mark it incorrect. So you would still get the points. Okay, so the important thing to remember when naming molecular compounds is that molecular compounds are those compounds made up of 2 nonmetals, and you have to include the prefixes when you're naming them. The prefixes are not needed for any ionic compound.